Before sunrise on May 29th, 1453, the last Roman emperor moved through the shadows of a dying city. He walked streets that had once carried the weight of empires, streets where senators had argued philosophy, where merchants had traded silk and spice from every corner of the known world, and where the sound of 1,000 languages once filled the air like music. Those streets were quiet now, too quiet, the kind of quiet that arrives not from peace, but from loss. Constantinople had once been home to 500,000 souls, but on that final morning, fewer than 50,000 remained to defend it. Around him, the city trembled with drums, distant cannon fire, and the low murmur of prayers drifting from open doorways. For more than 1,000 years, this place had been the eastern heart of Rome, a civilization that had outlasted its western half by nearly 1,000 years. It had survived plague, civil war, foreign invasion, and the slow erosion of time itself. Its walls were not merely stone. They were a statement, a declaration that some things could not be broken. Armies from the steppes, from the deserts, and from the seas had all come for Constantinople, and every one of them had turned back. But now, behind those legendary walls, the empire had nearly vanished. Not suddenly, and not all at once. It had been diminishing for generations, slowly losing territory, slowly losing population, and slowly losing the confidence that makes a civilization believe in its own survival. What remained was less an empire than the memory of one. A city, a palace, a church, and a name. And outside the walls waited a young sultan named Mehmed, 21 years old, burning with ambition, and absolutely certain that this city was his to take. To Mehmed, Constantinople was not just a prize, it was destiny. Muslim scholars had long held a prophecy that the city would one day fall to Islam, and Mehmed had grown up with those words. He had studied the previous attempts, the sieges that had come close, the strategies that had almost worked, and he had spent years preparing to be the one who finally succeeded. He arrived not as a young man hoping for glory, but as a commander who had done the mathematics of conquest and believed in the answer. To Emperor Constantine XI, the city meant something different entirely. It was inheritance, responsibility, and the last living expression of a civilization that stretched back through Rome to Greece and beyond. Constantine was not a man who had been given an easy throne. He had taken power at a moment when there was almost no power left to take. He knew, perhaps better than anyone, what he was defending and what it would mean to lose it. The siege had opened with thunder. Ottoman cannons, larger than anything the defenders had ever faced, some so massive they had to be cast on site because they could not be transported intact, roared against the ancient Theodosian Walls. The blasts shook loose stone, dust, and certainty from walls that had stood for 1,000 years and had never been breached by direct assault. And now, they were cracking. Each cannon blast sounded like the future breaking through the past. By day, sections of the outer wall collapsed in clouds of debris. By night, the defenders rushed out under cover of darkness to repair them. Soldiers, civilians, priests, anyone who could carry stone, worked to fill the breaches with earth, timber, and whatever they could find. They worked through the night, every night, knowing the cannons would open again at dawn. They were outnumbered, exhausted, and surrounded on every side. And still, they held. Constantine moved among the defenders not as a distant sovereign issuing orders from safety, but as a man who understood that if the walls fell, there was nowhere else to go. He appeared at the worst sections of wall, spoke to the men by name, and carried the weight of what he was asking them to do. And he shared it. For weeks, the defense held. And for a while, hope held with it. The great chain stretched across the Golden Horn, the narrow inlet that formed Constantinople's northern harbor, blocking the Ottoman fleet from entering the water. As long as the sea remained protected, The city could not be completely encircled. Supplies, however slim, might still reach them. Help, however unlikely, might still arrive. The chain was more than iron. It was the city's last open door. Then Mehmed did something the city believed was physically impossible. He gave the order to move his fleet overland. Under cover of darkness, Ottoman sailors and soldiers laid down greased wooden logs from the shore of the Bosphorus, up over the hills and down into the Golden Horn. Dozens of ships, warships and transport vessels were dragged out of the water and hauled across the land by teams of men pulling on ropes in the dark. It was an engineering feat of staggering scale, carried out in total secrecy. When Byzantine lookouts climbed to their posts at dawn, they saw sails in the harbor, sails where no sails had any right to be. The Golden Horn, which had been their sanctuary, now held an enemy fleet. The chain still floated across the water, exactly where it had always been, but its meaning had changed. It was no longer protection. It was the memory of protection. Inside the walls, something shifted that could not be repaired. The cannons kept firing, food grew scarce, and men who had been on the walls for weeks without proper rest began to make mistakes. Strange signs were reported in the sky, unusual light over the dome of Hagia Sophia, fog that moved against the wind, and shadows where there should have been none. In a city already frightened, these were not curiosities. They were omens. Whispers moved through the streets faster than any official word could follow, and people began to ask whether God had turned away from them. The Western rescue they had hoped for, the crusade that had been promised, negotiated, and prayed for, had not arrived in enough force. A handful of Genoese ships and a few hundred volunteers had come, but against an Ottoman army numbering in the tens of thousands, it was a gesture, not a salvation. The old empire waited behind fractured walls, while the new age gathered its full strength just outside. On the night before the final assault, the people of Constantinople filled Hagia Sophia. Every kind of person the city still contained came that night, soldiers still bearing the dust of the walls, merchants who had nowhere to run, and families who had tried to prepare their children for something no parent should have to explain. Orthodox and Catholic, who had spent decades in bitter theological argument, stood together beneath the great dome in the light of 1,000 candles. Whatever had divided them felt, in that moment, like a very small thing. Outside, Ottoman fires stretched across the land in every direction, a second horizon made of flame. Inside, the last Romans prayed. Constantine XI knew what morning would bring. He had been offered terms, his life, safe passage, and the chance to walk away. He had refused. He gave a final address to his commanders, asked forgiveness from anyone he had wronged, and then took his place at the walls. Before dawn, the final assault began. Wave after wave of Ottoman soldiers came at the walls. First the irregulars, expendable, and sent forward to exhaust the defenders. Then the elite janissaries, among the most disciplined fighting forces of their time. The noise was overwhelming. Drums, war cries, the constant percussion of cannon fire, and the screaming of men in the dark. Smoke swallowed the battlefield whole. The defenders fought with everything they had left, and for a time, they held even that assault. Then Giovanni Giustiniani fell. The Genoese commander who had organized and inspired the defense for months was struck by a bolt, some say a bullet, some say an arrow, and had to be carried from the walls. He was the man the defenders had trusted most, and when he disappeared from the line, fear spread faster than any order could stop it. Men began to look for exits that did not exist, and the defense began to come apart. Somewhere in the chaos, Ottoman soldiers found a small gate, the Kirka Porta, left unlatched in the confusion, and pushed through. Within minutes, flags bearing Ottoman crescents appeared on the walls. The cry went through the city that the enemy was inside, and the organized resistance became a rout. Constantine XI stripped off his imperial regalia, the purple, the insignia, the the symbols of a throne that had stood for 1100 years, and charged into the fighting on foot. Not as an emperor making a final stand for history, but as a man who had made a choice about how his story would end. He disappeared into the smoke and the chaos. His body was never definitively identified. By sunrise, it was over. Mehmed entered the city he had dreamed of his entire life and rode to Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in the Christian world, the architectural crown of an empire now extinguished. He dismounted at its doors, picked up a handful of earth, and poured it over his head in a gesture of humility before God. Then he walked inside, into the vast silence of a building that had witnessed over 900 years of history, and gave the order to convert it into a mosque. For the people who had lived within those walls, May 29th, 1453 was the end of their world. For scholars and historians, it is one of the conventional markers of the end of the Middle Ages itself, the moment the ancient world finally, fully closed. But Constantinople did not fall because one wall cracked, or one gate was left open, or one army was simply stronger. It fell because history had been pressing against it for centuries, wearing it down through plague and poverty and the slow retreat of empire. Until on one particular dawn in May, the pressure became greater than anything human hands could hold back. The ancient world does not end in a single catastrophic moment. It fades, year by year, prayer by prayer, stone by stone, until one morning the last emperor walks into the smoke, and everything he stood for becomes memory.